So for weeks now, we've been sharing this moment, this breathless moment when Jesus, standing there on the water in the middle of the storm with the waves all around and the wind swirling, the splashes and all of that, standing there outside the boat, calling to Peter and saying to him, "Come." This breathless moment as we wait to see what Peter will do next. Will Peter swing a leg out over the edge of the boat? Will he stretch a toe down to the water? Will he test it to see if it'll hold his weight? Peter, who's a professional fisherman, knows exactly what usually happens when you swing that leg over the boat. And is he going to dare it this time? This breathless moment caught our stewardship group's attention and our imagination. Oh gosh, it must be well over a year now. We've been dwelling with that and sitting with it, and that the tension, the breathlessness of that moment really caught our eyes. And we wanted others to join us with that. So we invited our middle school group, which we call Fusion, that meets on Sunday mornings over in the activity center. Somewhere between 20 to 40 kids gathered, lots of running, and then also talk about the Bible and about God. And we invited them to imagine it with us. If you want to take out the brochure that you received on your way in, you can see some of their reflections that they shared with us. Of course, we have the picture on the front that done in Play-Doh. Isn't that fabulous? Of this breathless moment, Jesus standing out there, Peter, who's looks like he's somewhere in between standing on the water and on his way down, but you can kind of imagine the storm around there. If you open it up, or on the back side, you'll see one of these. I love this one that shows Peter's response when Jesus says, "Come," and it shows Peter saying, "Cannonball!" Isn't it fabulous? And on the inside, this one actually brought up something that I hadn't thought about in this story, the reminder that there are three different groups here. There's Jesus out on the water, there's Peter, and that moment that we're waiting to see what Peter's going to do, but there's also the other disciples too, and they also know the usual, what usually happens when you swing your leg out over the edge of the boat, but they care about Peter. Would they be glad to see him go, or would they be, as the artist imagined here, trying to stop him, to save his life? "Hey, get back here, stop," the artist said. Aren't they fabulous? So we've been sitting with this moment and in this breathless moment between when Jesus says, "Come," and Peter begins to move. And all of this happens right after, on the other side of the lake, the disciples have been with Jesus in the midst of an almost unthinkable crowd, like 15,000 people, men, women, and children. And they've been there all day, and it's in the Middle East, so the sun is hot, and they don't have any food. These are peasants. And the disciples get worried about them, and they come to Jesus and say, "Jesus, you need to send them so that they can go find some food. No McDonald's, no Subways anywhere nearby. Jesus, you need to let them go." And Jesus says, "No, that's okay. You take care of it." And all they have is the lunch that they brought for themselves, just barely enough for these grown men, 5 loaves and 2 little fish. But you remember the story. They bring it to Jesus in the midst of all of this, who blesses and breaks, and then they serve, and there's enough. In fact, for 15,000 peasants who hardly ever get enough to eat, there's enough for all of them, plus leftovers. Baskets and baskets left over. When Jesus is in the middle, there is enough. And now Jesus sends the disciples ahead of him out into the boat, out onto the lake, and they're rowing away as Jesus stays back to dismiss the crowds and then finally to have some quiet time with God. Yes, Jesus also needs that time one-on-one with God to pray, and if Jesus thinks that is important for the state of his soul, we also should pay attention to that and are invited to that. It reminds us how important it is to have our time to pray and listen. And now the unthinkable, the worst thing that could happen to these professional fishermen, a storm comes in. And as professional fishermen, they know how dangerous this is. The boats are not that big, and they're pretty tippy, and storms are dangerous. Of course they're afraid. The wind is against them. The waves, the spray, you can imagine it's coming over the edges. They're bailing, they're scared, and in the middle of all of this comes Jesus walking right through the waves, up one, down the other, the wind swirling around him, the spray. Here comes Jesus. Of course they think it's a ghost. And Jesus calls ahead of himself, no, no, no. Take courage. It's me. Do not be afraid. I cannot imagine what Peter is thinking at this moment. I don't understand. I don't know if Peter is, does Peter want to prove that it's Jesus, to prove that it's really him? He says, if it's really you, call me out there. Does Peter want proof? But man, that is a scary way to ask for proof. Is Peter trying to prove himself? Is he caught up in the moment? Or does Peter just grab whatever words happen to be in some corner of his mind, threw them together, and blurted it out? I lean toward the last one because Peter has a history and a habit of doing that. But what a remarkable, ridiculous thing to say. Jesus is standing on the water outside of the boat. And Peter says, if it's really you, tell me to get out of the boat. I don't know what he's thinking. I can't even imagine what that would be like. This breathless moment. As Peter's holding on to the edge of the boat, looks out at Jesus with all the winds and the water and the waves swirling and rising there. And Peter swings a leg over, stretches a foot down, and then the other. He's holding on now and watching Jesus lets go and takes a step. Peter walks on water because Jesus invited him. I don't know how he could do that. Not the walk on water part. That's obvious. That's all Jesus, because none of us know how to do that. That's all Jesus. But the letting go. How can you do that in the middle of a storm with your feet on top of the waves? Paul, writing to this church in Corinth, talks about another church in Macedonia, a deeply poor church. It says, in their extreme poverty, discovered incredible generosity. How can they do that? Except Paul gives us the answer, and he says, first, they gave themselves to the Lord. Everything else follows. First, they gave themselves to the Lord, and everything else follows. Peter, too. Jesus has invited him. He's standing there on the water, holding on, with his gaze fixed at Jesus. He gives himself to the Lord and steps out of the boat. Takes a step in faith. And he walks on the water because Jesus invited him. Yes, he does sink. Yes, Peter gets scared. Although I find it interesting, it's not the waves, and it's not the spray, and it's not the lightning, and all of the likely things that actually scare Peter. It's the wind, the one thing he can't see, that scares him. Now, I get that, because that sounds human to me. We are so often more afraid of the things that we imagine, or that we can't see, or that we think leads to something else. Those are the things that worry us the most, what might be, and that send us looking, reaching, wanting somebody to provide some security for us, or grasping so that we could pretend that we can do it ourselves. The things we imagine, or the things that people want us to imagine so that they can make us afraid of the right things, those are the ones that send us sinking more than anything else, aren't they? So I get it that Peter would be afraid of the wind, and it would be the wind that makes him worry. But do you notice what happens next? Peter has never took his eyes off of Jesus. He says, "Lord, save me," and Jesus does. Somebody sent me a little meme on Facebook that says, when you feel like you're sinking under the storms of life, remember you have a lifeguard who walks on water. Peter says, "Lord, save me," and Jesus does. Because Jesus is there. In the middle of the storms, in the scariest of stuff, when we're at both our best and our worst, in that moment, Jesus is there and will not let us sink. And now, Peter is holding hands with Jesus. And when they get back in the boat, the wind that scared Peter the most, even that stops. So there we are, in that breathless moment, when together we come to learn and grow, to want to know more about Jesus, to follow, to discover Jesus' love and the abundant life he promised, that we sense and that we live together. There we are, in between, gathered in the swirls and all of the storms of modern day life, all the voices that want to tell us how we can be safe and we can be our best selves. There we are, in the middle of all the fears that swirl around us, and a voice comes and says, "Come." Jesus says, "Come." Jesus says, "Step out of the boat. Come out where I am." Jesus says, "Follow me and step out in faith." Now, that'll be different for each of us, right? Because we all are at different places and we're all living different lives. And for all of us, there is an invitation. The step will be different for each. That letter to the church in Corinth, Paul talks about that, about how because each of us are in different situations, that next step in faith is a different thing for each of us. But the invitation is the same. For some of us, it will be to step into serving in a way that we don't feel at all equipped, as we heard shared with us through these past weeks. For some of us, it will be to be served instead of serving, to receive the help that then allows us to help others, and so to be transformed by grace. For some of us, it will be that scary step of thinking about giving and the fact that God has given us everything we are and everything we have. It's all God's anyways. And so to think not just in terms of what can I spare, what's left, but what is right. And to think in terms of proportions. What part of what God gives me am I called to share? And for some of us, it will be to take yet another step. whatever, in giving, in serving, in whatever that is, the invitation for each of you is different, but it is the same Jesus who says, come. Follow. Step out where I am. Step out in faith. It's time to get out of the boat. So here we are in this breathless moment when Jesus says to you today, come. Let's go. Come see where we can go together. Come grow in faith. Come on and step out in faith.